suspect dies at the hands of a police officer. Michael Brown shot and killed by a cop in Ferguson, Missouri. No indictment. Eric Garner died while being taken into custody on Staten Island. His death, the result of a chokehold. No indictment. Well, tonight, a different kind of story. A Kai Gurley, unarmed, shot and killed in a dark stairwell by a rookie NYPD officer in Brooklyn. And tonight, that officer who pulled the trigger is now preparing to turn himself into authorities.
A cop in New York is being brought to justice over an accidental shooting. Law enforcement has to now be aware of cell phone apps that will pinpoint their location. And the national discussion on policing has really yet to take shape, while some are seeking to minimize the potential for more citizen violence. It's a tough issue with plenty of talking points. Let's begin. Our guest is Professor of Criminology at the University of Missouri St. Louis. Former president of the American Society of Criminology, Dr. Richard Rosenfeld joins us today. Dr. Rosenfeld, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Where do law enforcement agencies need to start if they are really serious about changing the way people look at cops and policing? What's the one spot that they have to start at that maybe some people don't think about?
Well, I think there are more than one things that police departments need to do, and in fact many are doing or certainly testing. One is the use of so-called less lethal weapons. The Ferguson Police Department has announced that they're testing one of those devices now. And the other, I think, is to engage in a pretty wholesale revision of training for incidents that could lead to an officer-involved shooting or other kind of police use of force. Let me talk a bit, if you don't mind, about the use of less lethal weapons. I'm all in favor of a great deal of testing and training around the use of such weapons, but I do think it's important to point out that many officer-involved shootings involve split-second decisions on the part of the officer. The device the Ferguson Police Department is currently testing is a device that would have the officer attached to the end of the firearm, a device that would blunt the impact of firearm discharge.
Basically an orange plastic bracket, as I understand it, correct?
Correct. That, if we think about officers having to make split-second decisions, attaching that device to the end of the firearm may not be an option. I would suggest that those less lethal weapons, ones like the one undergoing test at Ferguson, might be more appropriate for crowd control purposes than for use in situations in which officers have to make a very, very short time decision about whether and how to use force against a suspect.
Okay, let me jump on that here, because many times, and I've talked to many people in law enforcement, known them for many years, they will tell you that often you get one shot, one chance, or it's you that's going to be the victim in a case like this. So how does this then allow them to still take that shot? Because, and again, please, I'm not a scientist here, but I'm just guessing, if you shoot, it has 1/5 the velocity of the bullet itself and does not stop the individual coming at you. Does that still then not allow them to come back at the officer?
Well, yeah, it might well. The same issue has arisen around the use of tasers. Tasers typically, but not always, stop an individual in his or her tracks. Some individuals, however, are able to overcome the taser and continue an attack on an officer or others. Again, I would say less lethal weapons have to be tested. One of the functions of police officers, in addition to serving the public, is to protect the public. And officers also, of course, have the right and the duty to protect themselves and others on the scene. Less lethal weapons may not be an option, and the one that is undergoing test in Ferguson may not be an option in situations in which officers have to make a split-second decision and do not have the time to attach a device to the end of their firearm.
Then in many ways, I've only got a few seconds left before we take a break, we'll come back, but in many ways the officer's got to make that decision before the actual moment happens, whether they are going to have a lethal weapon in their hands or a non-lethal weapon, because by the time they have to use it, the chance is already pretty much passed.
Correct. And when we come back, let's, if you don't mind, talk about some training issues that might help reduce the number of fatal killings that arise from these situations.
We do want to talk about that indeed. Please stand by for a couple of moments. We're going to get to that national discussion then about policing, how things should change, and what changes could be detrimental to law enforcement being able to do their jobs. Because at the end of the day, they still want to come home safe, and they need to protect the citizenry. It's coming up next on MidPoint. Back to work with a former criminologist in residence at the City of St. Louis Department of Public Safety, current professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri St. Louis, Professor Richard Rosenfeld. Professor, let's go ahead and get now to some of those things that move us forward here now from what has happened. Specifically, I want to talk very briefly about what we led off with at the beginning of the first segment, and that is the police officer in New York City indicted in the shooting death of a man in a hallway. He had been on the force less than 18 months, a darkened stairwell. Apparently panicked, fired a shot, struck the guy. Does this not point to us to the fact that we need better training, the cops need better education, that we need to make sure that they are better aware of the situations, because it seems like much of what we're running into is a lack of good training?
I think that's correct. I should say training is no panacea to reduce officer-involved shootings or other types of police use of force to zero. I don't think that's going to happen, but training can certainly help. And let me suggest one concept that's been floating around recently, and certainly many police departments are looking at, and that's the idea, although I don't think many police officers like the way it's phrased, the idea of so-called tactical retreat or tactical withdrawal. Now, what does that mean? Let's take the case of Officer Wilson and Michael Brown in Ferguson. I think it's beyond dispute that Michael Brown and Officer Wilson were engaged in some sort of encounter, violent encounter, while Officer Wilson was sitting in his police car and Michael Brown was leaning in. At that point, Officer Wilson might have simply driven ahead 10 yards. Now, what would have happened? If Michael Brown were holding onto the car, he might have fallen to the pavement. Very unlikely, however, that he would have died.
Well, but fair to say, too, that officers many times in a situation like that, they are immediately in fear of their life. And again, we don't know where his feet were, if they were in contact with the gas pedal at the time, what could have happened. So aren't we really talking, though, Professor, in your instance here, about really a lot of decisions that have to be made when many times you have that split second, you can only make one correct decision?
Well, you're absolutely right. And always the circumstances have to be taken into account. Note, Michael Brown was unarmed. In most police shootings, as far as we know, and I have to point out, we know very little about these nationwide because there is no nationwide database to look at. But in my own city of St. Louis, we find that relatively few police shootings involve an unarmed suspect. So it may be that tactical withdrawal or tactical retreat is only an option with unarmed suspects.
Having to say that, though, isn't it really behooving the officers at times? Because certainly we have criminals on the street that are better armed even than some of the cops sometimes. There's guns floating everywhere around America. Don't the cops have to immediately think that somebody may be armed and try to not only protect their life, but the life of the citizenry around them?
I think officers have to make that assumption until the facts of the situation suggest otherwise. Recall in the Michael Brown and Officer Wilson encounter. That encounter unfolded over several seconds, during which it was apparent, I think, to Officer Wilson that Michael Brown was unarmed. What I'm suggesting is using that as an example. Officers can be trained to engage in alternatives to the use of lethal force when appropriate. And I think that should become part of the training. It should become as instinctive for an officer to consider such alternatives at the same time he or she is considering the use of a firearm to fend off a suspect or an attacker.
I've only got about a minute left. Isn't it also fair to say that if we're going to talk about this, and yes, there needs to be better education of the police officers, but members of the citizenry need to understand right away you don't challenge an officer?
We do not. The cardinal principle of all police officers training with respect to encounters with citizens is to take control of the situation. Citizens need to recognize that. That's what officers are trained to do. In some sense, that's what we expect them to do. Now, we also want that control to be applied fairly with due consideration of alternatives to the use of force. That's what officers are trained to do. Citizens have to recognize that.
We got so much here that we have yet to cover here. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and we still have to get down one of these days to this national discussion on law enforcement and policing, because certainly it seems as if it's taking a little bit too much time. And I think people are waiting to hear what the results of these and these various commissions are. Professor, I appreciate your comments. Please join us again at another time, and let's dig into this a little deeper here and find out where we go next in creating that solid policing for all the citizens across the United States.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, as parents purposely expose their kids to the measles, the time has come to start holding potentially negligent doctors to the fire in stopping what could be a killer spread of the disease. What happens when the doctor himself or herself decides that they don't want to give out the vaccination? That and more when we continue right here on MidPoint.